For most of human history, cities did not exist. If you were a human living 15,000 years ago, the idea of thousands of strangers living together in one place would have sounded insane, maybe even dangerous. You lived in small bands. You knew everyone around you by name. Groups larger than 100 or so people rarely stayed together for long. Food ran out, tempers flared, and people scattered again. And yet today, more than half of humanity lives packed into cities. Some of them hold over 20 million people, strangers stacked on top of strangers, and almost none of them related by blood. Skyscrapers, subways, sewage systems, traffic lights, all of it built on an idea that started as something much smaller and much stranger, because cities were never planned. No human tribe sat down and said, let's invent a place where 10 million strangers live shoulder to shoulder. Cities were an accident, and the strangest part is that the thing that made cities possible wasn't a grand design at all. It was grain. To understand how this happened, you have to imagine the world around 12,000 years ago, right at the edge of the last ice age. Humans everywhere lived as hunter-gatherers. Small bands moved constantly, following animals, following seasons, following whatever food the land offered that month. Nobody stayed anywhere long enough to build something permanent. Why would you? The deer might move, the berries might run out. Staying still meant starving. But in a few scattered pockets of the world, something changed. In the Fertile Crescent, in parts of what's now Iraq and Syria, wild wheat and barley grew thick and easy to gather. People noticed that if you dropped a few seeds near your camp, more plants grew there the next season. At first, this wasn't farming. It was barely even intentional. It was just humans being a little lazy, letting food grow closer to home instead of chasing it across the landscape. Now here's the part that changes everything. Grain can be stored. Meat rots in days. Berries rot in hours. But dried wheat and barley can sit in a pit or a clay jar for months without spoiling. For the first time in human history, food didn't have to be eaten immediately or lost. It could be saved. And a group that could save food didn't need to move anymore. Staying in one place stopped being a death sentence and started being an advantage. So people stayed. And once people stayed, something happened that nobody had planned for. Populations exploded. Hunter-gatherer bands rarely grew large. Moving with children and elders is brutally hard, so birth spacing stayed wide. But settled life removed that constraint. Women could have children closer together. More children survived. Small camps swelled into villages within a few generations, not because anyone decided to build a village, but because nobody had a reason to leave anymore. This wasn't just a comfortable theory. Scientists actually dug up the proof. A team of bioarchaeologists led by Clark Spencer Larson at Ohio State spent 25 years studying human remains at one of these early settlements, and their findings, published in 2019, showed exactly what happens when people stop moving and start staying. Once families anchored themselves near a stored food supply, the population didn't just grow. It grew fast enough to create problems no hunter-gatherer band had ever faced: overcrowding, spreading infections, and even violence between neighbors. In other words, the very same surplus that let people stay also forced thousands of strangers into a kind of proximity evolution never prepared them for. And once people were anchored, new problems appeared that hunter-gatherers never had to deal with. If everyone farms the same field, who owns the harvest? If grain is stored somewhere, who guards it? If 100 families live near each other instead of 20, who settles the arguments? These weren't questions early humans set out to answer philosophically. They were questions forced on them by sheer proximity. And slowly, without anyone inventing government on purpose, informal answers started hardening into roles. Someone organized the grain stores. Someone mediated the disputes. Someone tracked who planted what and where. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these early settlements, maybe Çatalhöyük, in what's now Turkey, around 9,000 years ago. Thousands of people lived there, packed into mud brick houses built wall to wall, with no streets between them, walking across rooftops to get around. It wasn't designed like a city. It grew like one, house pressed against house, generation after generation, because staying close to the grain and close to each other simply worked better than spreading out. And once you have permanent buildings, stored surplus, and enough people living close together, something else becomes possible for the first time. Not everyone has to farm. If a village produces more grain than the farmers themselves can eat, that extra food can feed someone who spends their day doing something else instead, shaping pottery, weaving cloth, building walls, keeping records. This is the moment specialization was born, and specialization is the actual engine that turns a village into a city. A hunter-gatherer band has no tool makers, no priests, no soldiers, no scribes. It can't afford them. A grain surplus can. Think about how strange that chain of cause and effect really is. A few humans casually tossing seeds near their camp, mostly out of convenience, eventually led to walled settlements, then temples, then written records, then kings, then armies, then the first laws in human history carved into clay. Nobody planned civilization. Civilization was the byproduct of not wanting to walk as far for dinner. Cities kept growing for the same reason they started. More people meant more surplus. More surplus meant more specialists. More specialists meant better tools, defenses, and better trade meant even more people wanted to live there. It fed itself, and it came with real costs almost immediately. Denser populations meant disease spread faster than it ever had among scattered hunter-gatherers. Stored grain meant something worth stealing, which meant walls, which meant war became organized instead of occasional. Hierarchies that started as informal grainkeepers hardened into rulers who never worked the fields themselves. The very same surplus that freed some humans to become artists and thinkers also freed others to become kings who owned people. And yet, the pull never stopped. Every ancient city that archaeologists have uncovered, Uruk, Jericho, Mohenjo-Daro, tells the same underlying story with different details. Somewhere nearby, there was a surplus, and around that surplus, strangers who would never have tolerated each other on the open plains learned to live stacked together, trading, arguing, building, because the alternative, walking away from stored food and permanent shelter, no longer made sense. Some anthropologists think this single shift from mobile scarcity to settled surplus changed human psychology as much as human geography. We evolved for tens of thousands of years to live in small bands where everyone knew everyone. Cities forced us to live surrounded by total strangers, something almost no other species does at this scale. Every stranger you pass on a crowded street today, ignoring them instead of fighting or fleeing, is running on social wiring. Humans had to invent almost overnight, in evolutionary terms, once cities appeared. For thousands of years, this transformation happened slowly, house by house, harvest by harvest, with no human alive at the time realizing they were witnessing the birth of something that would eventually put 10 million strangers inside a single skyline. All because a few humans, sometime around 12,000 years ago, decided it was easier to let the wheat grow where it already stood. And tonight, somewhere in a city of millions, someone is going to walk past 1,000 strangers without a second thought, without knowing that this entire way of living began with a handful of people who simply got tired of chasing their food.